All right, Mr. Sapora here, Marine Biology, and today we're going to be continuing with talking about marine environments. So I have a weekly question set that goes along with this, and that'll be posted in Google Classroom. You can access it there. We're going to cover two different marine environments today. We're going to cover the rocky shoreline, and then we're going to go inland a little ways and talk about estuaries, right? I'm saying go inland, and we're talking about marine. Okay, we'll get into that. Let's just jump straight into the presentation, shall we? As soon as it loads. It'll glitchy. And here we go. Start off with a bit of a review from last week. So start off with that review. Last week, marine environments. And we're still talking about temperate coastal seas because that is our local marine environment here along the Oregon coast. Last week we talked about a specific environment there, the Neritic Benthic Zone, which is that area right from basically the low tide, the subtide line, out to about 200 meters deep, so out to about 600 feet deep, and including the bottom of the ocean. This is the most productive area of the ocean. Doesn't matter what marine, a zone you're in, as far as like tropical or polar or temperate coastal. The Neritic Benthic is the most productive areas in the oceans because light reaches the bottom and there's nutrients and things like that that reach the bottom as well. And benthic, of course, means bottom, so that consists of either soft sediment or rock, mud. And neritic is a term that we use to basically be that near the shore zone is the way that I think about it. Not on the shore, but near the shore. And where is it on this little diagram down here? Well, folks, with our little red circle, it's right there, okay? Usually consists of continental shelves. And the Neritic Benthic Zone is really that subtidal area, right? In other words, it is below what the tide really reveals. We're going to step up and we're going to go into the Intertidal Zone today because this is the area that we can access the most readily. We just had a great minus tide here last week. A lot of people were out clamming and tide pooling early in the morning. Usually you get really good or strong tides, good highs, good lows, strong highs, strong lows, around the full moon or a new moon especially. And so let's talk about tide pool zones, the fun ones to explore. This is, again, temperate coastal seas, but now we're going to talk about this in the terms of the littoral zone. This isn't the Neritic zone. This is what we call the littoral zone. And this is a zone that is literally on the shore, right? You're literally in that 1 foot in each world. And we're going to talk about the rocky intertidal zone. Danger, danger. Why do I say danger? Because it's a harsh physical environment. Okay. By harsh physical, I mean that there are daily changes in a lot of the abiotic characteristics of this environment, meaning the temperature fluctuates greatly. If you're covered in water, it's 50 degrees, and then suddenly tide goes out and you're out baking in the sun. Daily there's changes in salinity, how salty it is. If you're left in a tide pool that's sitting out in the sun, the salinity can increase as water evaporates. If it rains, you're suddenly in a pool of fresh water. So those sudden dramatic changes can be really intense stressors on organisms. And the amount of dissolved oxygen. Again, if you're in a pool that's sitting out in the sun for half the day or all day, the oxygen in the water can basically just go away and disappear and be consumed and used up as the water evaporates and respire. So organisms that live in this environment, excuse me, are adapted to stress. They have to be. So they have a number of cool adaptations that you can see, physical ones and then biochemical ones. There's adaptations to freshwater. Rain, so if you're a clam or a mussel or a barnacle, you can kind of seal up and keep that salty environment on the inside, and then the rain will just go around you. If you're something like an anemone right up in here, You can swell up. So if they get suddenly flushed with fresh water, which causes cells, salty cells, to swell, they can actually explode, which is deadly, called lysine. But with your anemone or an Adarian, you can just kind of poof out, and even echinoderms can do this. Um, Another adaptation, of course, is breaking waves. So you have to be anchored really solidly to the rocks to withstand surging waves and things like that, or you have to have armor as well. And then adaptations, of course, to predators, because you're exposed for part of the day. You're really open to a lot of predators having access to you. In raccoons and other mammals will go down to tide pools and forage, and of course birds, right? Gulls and many other birds are out there, oyster catchers, hammering away at you. So it's a stressful place. Why does anybody live here then, right? I mean, I just named a million reasons to die, so why would you even go there? The reason that organisms live there is there's a ton of nutrients. Picture when the wind blows and you're got a swimming pool that hasn't been cleaned in a while. All the leaves pile around the edges. Okay, ocean's the same way. So all the nutrients and all this detritus will pile up near the edges, near the shoreline. And as the waves come in, bringing in more of this stuff, it piles up and piles up. So there's a ton of nutrients packed in here along the shoreline. Have you ever seen that sea foam that develops on the beaches after a big storm? That's all amino acids and proteins mainly that have been whipped up and kind of blown into the shore. So all these nutrients are available for organisms. They just have to endure living in this harsh environment. There's also a high niche diversity, which means there's a number of little microhabitats, available spaces to kind of fit into. So you can pack a lot of organisms into a small space with a high amount of niche diversity. Because there is all of this abundant nutrients, there's also intense competition for resources in these intertidal zones. Really say no more there. And you can see all the organisms packed in there. And if you really want to look at like things like intraspecific and interspecific competition, which we've talked about in biology class, tide pools are a wonderful place to look at that. There's competition within populations of organisms. Look at how anemones kind of aggregate and spread themselves out. Look at how things just crowd around when the tide goes out into certain zones, vying for space, and then look at competition between different species as well. Okay, so we're going to jump into some of the different tide zones. You can break the intertidal region into really 4 different zones, and you can see those on here. At the very highest is what we call the spray zone, and this is the area that gets splashed and sprayed by water on the daily, but never really ever gets fully submerged by water. But the salt water does have an impact on it, and it does get covered in plankton, and there are certain organisms that live there, pictured up here, like limpets and snails and things like that. The high tide zone, this is where the water only covers it during the very highest tides. The mid tide zone, probably one of the most productive tide zones that you have access to regularly. This is when the tide, goes out. You can get out here pretty easily, and there's a ton of stuff. A definitive organism of that zone are the mussels. Mytilus is really the top of the mid-tide zone. It makes a great band. So you're in the mid-tide zone when you see mussels. You're going past it into the high tide zone when you top them out, and below it, once you get below mussels, you start to enter into this very, very low tide zone, right? Or the sublittoral, where you're almost in an area that usually isn't exposed, and you're starting to see some organisms that you would see in the Neritic Benthic Zone out here. This is your highest diversity. So here's a picture. You can kind of see the mussel bed up in here. So this is the top of the mid-tide zone in here, right? And then above this is the high tide zone. There's a nice band right in here. And then above that, you've got the spray zone up in here. Not much lives in the spray zone. There's not a lot of density. You'll see a lot of barnacles right in here and limpets and things. Then mussels in the mid-tide zone. The bottom of the mid-tide zone, you start to get anemones and sea stars. And then once you get below this is all kind of mid-tide in here. You start to get really into your low sublittoral zone down below that. And then if you can step away looking at it, the seaweed, the kelp, is going to be down in your low tide zone in here. And then you've got your mid up in here, your high right above that, and then finally your spray zone right up in here. Your spray zone's pretty barren, but there's still tide pool organisms that you find there. Once you get up in here, you're out of that tide zone and you're onto land in just the littoral, upper littoral zone. So let's take a look at these in some detail with some notes. Totes, my goats. Okay, so we call this vertical zonation because these zones basically run vertically, right? Your spray zone's at the very highest, and then you move down vertically into your low tide zone, and then finally your sublittoral in there. Okay, so the very high zone, the highest of the high zones, is the splash or the spray zone. Only gets sprayed by waves and storms. Certain species that define this zone, Cathalymus dali, which is the little acorn barnacle, and then Lotia pelta as well, your shield limpet right here. Those are kind of organisms you expect to see up in that spray zone. The high tide zone, covered at the very highest tides, you can find rockweed up in here, Fucus gardneri, and Littorina siccana, so the sea snail as well, turban snail, or Sitka periwinkle, actually. One in there. There's your spray zone. Okay. So here's another diagram, just looking at these again. Your spray zone, your extreme high tide zone, and then we just covered those two. And now we're going to move down, right? So you've got your limpets, barnacles, see your rockweeds in here as well, your fucus. And then we're going to move down from that high tide zone into the mid tide zone. And this is where your density is really going to increase. So your mid tide zone, it's covered and uncovered twice a day. So the high tide zone can sometimes be out for a full day, fully exposed. But this is where, or for most of the day, right? It might only get covered by one tide. But your mid tide zone is uncovered and covered with each tide, right? And we get 2 highs and 2 lows in a day. So this means it's covered twice and it's uncovered twice in our region of the world. It's the richest in the biodiversity. In other words, the most diversity within a very tiny area. So if you were to take something like a square meter and throw it down anywhere there and count the variety and the abundance of different species in there, you would get the highest mixture of not only different species, but the highest density of numbers of individuals as well within there. And so characteristic species in this zone consist of Mytilus californianus, fun one to say, California beach mussel. Anthopleura xanthogrammica at the bottom. So you can see here you got the Mytilus, and then right below them, it's like Mytilus and then Anthopleura. They make these really distinct bands. Xanthogrammica specifically, and Elegantissima, a little red fringed one. We mixed in with it at times. Mopalia ciliata, so that would be your chitin. And then Pisaster ocraceus at the lower end of it. So Pisasters feed on mussels. It is their main food source, and they sort of wipe mussels out of the lower mid-tide zone because they can spend all day down there. The upper mid-tide zone begins to get stressful for sea stars, for Pisasters. The amount of exposure to air and to heat and other things like that, they don't do so well in it. So they sort of eat out all the mussels from the bottom layer, and then the mussels establish themselves higher up where they're kind of safe and get really dense in there. Okay, the low tide zone is the last one, and species cannot tolerate air exposure in this zone pretty much at all, just for a few hours, and that's usually only maybe once or twice a month that these actually do get exposed. The very lowest tides. You've got a lot of algae down here, so this is when the tide goes out so far that you start to be able to walk on these big kelp beds. And you're not walking on rockweed, you're walking on like egregia, you're walking on even some laminarias, and you can see things like purple sea urchins out here as well, Strongylos centrotus, purpuratus. Good places to see these. You can see these in Oceanside when the tide really rips out, and then down in Newport out there at the lighthouse, they have a trail that goes down because you're out on this point. You actually get exposed to some really deep tide zones out there. And here's some examples of purple sea urchin beds you can find in some of the deeper tide pools when the tide goes way, way out and you're in that low, low tide zone. And again, they don't like being exposed to air at all, so they will be down in the pools that are covered in water, even when the tide is all the way out, generally where you find them. They aggregate, they will burrow down and make their own holes. These are organisms that can live 50, 60 years. I believe 70 on some. Really crazy long time. And so they burrow out these holes and come back to them every day when the tide goes out. Kind of cool. Oh yeah, and there's the holes that they've burrowed out. Isn't that cool? And as they grow, they will burrow their hole bigger. They can actually work away the rock like that. I just find that fascinating. And that's just a cool zoom in. What a crazy animal, right? Okay, I had a handout on the tide zones, but obviously on this online version, we're going to skip it this time around. But I believe I still do have it hyperlinked here. So let's just take a quick look at that. And while that loads up, I'll jump back over here. This person down here, you can see they have a little square. It's a plastic square. These are called quadrats, and these are used commonly in biology for sampling. You might have an area that you go back to every single time and sample it. There would be some type of marker place there, a place where they are doing continuous sampling. Oregon State University is Boiler Bay, which is down near Depot Bay on the north side of it. They have some markers down on the rocks there that are basically hammered into the rocks. So they're permanent markers with numbers. You would go and put one corner of the quadrat on that, and then maybe you'd have another marker in the other corner, so you get it right in the same spot. And you would go back and you would see what type of organisms were there and how many of each were there. And you would do this year after year after year. And they're looking to see change over time, either due to climate change, due to ocean level either rising or falling, disease, invasive species, predation. There's all kinds of factors that can be looked at if you do see change, or maybe you're looking to see what areas are constant, and then you would want to measure other areas that are similar, maybe up and down the coast, and then compare these. It's a great thing to do and get some baseline data, and then if something did happen, such as when we had the sea star wasting disease, you then can go and really start to see how that area changes if you know what it's been like traditionally. The handout that I have linked here is taking forever to load, so we're going to move past, and then I will come back to it once that little wheel stops spinning. Oh my God. Okay. There's also an article published by the Webb's Friends in Metarts Bay. There's excellent explanation of tide pool zones and then some of the stresses and adaptations of tide pool organisms. It's written specifically for like the oceanside area, so it is excellent. It has photos from there, and it talks about many of our local species, so I encourage you to look at that article as well. I have it linked here, and it's linked on the weekly questions. Okay, next environment we're going to talk about. So we've talked about we're kind of going from, out in the ocean, inland, right? So we started with the whole Neritic Benthic, this whole continental shelf, 200 meters deep, all the way up. And this is your most productive area. The most productive area within that whole zone are the kelp forests. Then we went up into the rocky shorelines. I'm going to skip sandy beaches for now because they're very unproductive, actually, as an ecosystem. They're cool to walk on, but there's not much going on there. We're going to jump into the most productive ecosystems, estuaries. By definition, estuary is a partly enclosed body of water where fresh water mixes with salt water. A little mixing going on in there. So the salt water comes in from the ocean, and of course fresh water comes in from all the different sources here. In our area, Tillamook Bay, which is pictured here and over here, we have 5 different rivers that come feeding in, giving us a pretty large bay. We actually have the second largest estuary on the Oregon coast here. Cool. Interesting fact. Hey, Sapora, what's the first? Good question. The first one is down in southern Oregon, south central Oregon, and it would be Coos Bay, actually, the largest estuary. But Coos Bay has been heavily impacted by human usage and changing and altering the estuary. We'll talk about how that happens in a minute. Whereas ours is very healthy in comparison. So we have the second largest and one of the healthiest. The healthiest estuary on the coast would actually probably be Netart's Bay or Sand Lake. Those two are some of the most productive on the entire West Coast. Interesting facts. Okay, so it's this partly enclosed body of water where salt and fresh water mix. And because of that, we say the water is brackish. We don't really say that it's saline or salty, although it basically is. But brackish means that it's anywhere from 0.05 salinity units, PSUs, partial salinity units, to full on 35, which is what the ocean is. And this really changes with either the influx of the tide or an influx of fresh water, such as high freshwater flow like storms in the wintertime, which bring in a lot of fresh water. And it changes with the tide. The closer you get to the mouth, the more salty it gets. The farther upstream you get, right, towards where the rivers actually come in, the fresher the water gets. But the salt can actually go up the rivers, depending on the tide as well, because you will see the rivers rise and fall here because of the tide. Estuaries are critically important habitat for many species. Many species rely on these for part or all of their life cycle. Many juvenile organisms have part of their juvenile stage is spent inside estuaries, including many of our flatfish, including almost all of our bivalves, including some of our rockfish and other things like that. So it's an important habitat, and it's mainly because there's super high primary production in an estuary. It's high primary production because there's a lot of nutrients coming in. Again, huge nutrient input. They're shallow, so water reaches the bottom. There's a lot of mixing of cold, rich ocean water with oxygen-rich, rivers that are coming down from all the rainwater that's being brought in. And so this creates just a broth of productivity. It's pretty rad. They can also be highly impacted by humans. Estuaries are downstream of everything, so they're where all the pollution ends up dumping and being put. People often put factories, put processing plants, put mills and other things down near the water's edge, near estuaries, and a lot of stuff gets dumped into them. So they have been historically heavily polluted. They can store up pollutants because of the porous nature of their substrate. So the muds and the silts with all the worms and all the things just down there burrowing and all of the fine sediments. You start dumping, some especially heavy metals or PCBs or other things in there. They can stay in there for a long, long time, basically until they're cleaned out. So you can really skunk an estuary, basically. Dredging has a huge impact. So if we were to bring a ship up in there to dig up the bottom so that we could move boats in and out, this can really damage the bottom of the estuary where all your eelgrass beds are and change the entire nature and character of it. And this is what they did to Coos Bay, the largest estuary in Oregon. It is heavily dredged and heavily shipped, and it is not the estuary that it once was at all. It is not nearly as productive as it once was. It's pretty heavily impacted by that, and all the mills and floating of logs and things like that have added to the pollution of it as well. And then development. People build down along these areas as well, and you can see from this map of Tillamook all the development that's gone on right along the edge of our estuary as well. So we've got to be mindful of that, right? Here, at least, we treat our water and sewer. In other places in the world, or even within this country, sometimes overflow will pour into the estuaries. I know Portland even dumps raw sewage into the Willamette River, which then dumps into the Columbia, which then dumps into the Columbia estuary as well. And if I was eating clams from that, I wouldn't. Clams from that. Ooh, that's a nice picture. Okay. So let's talk about productivity in estuaries, why they're so productive. So there's patterns of fresh and salt water, and they change with the tides. High density saltwater sinks underneath, goes on the bottom of fresh water, which mixes coming from the top. So as the rainwater comes in, can you see my hand? Not really. It rides on top, and then the salt water pushes up underneath. And here's a typical kind of photo. You can see this interface, and we call this a saltwater wedge because the salt water would be the darker water off of here, and the rainwater would be the lighter colored water. And the salt water is going to be denser, so it's actually going to be slipping underneath, and it's going to be at like a 45-degree angle, wedging underneath and driving. And that causes nutrients to mix upwards. They mix up towards the lighter water. So the ocean's bringing in a lot of nutrients as well. And so is the rivers. And so when they hit these collided mix, and it mixes nutrients and oxygen, the more protected, the more productive. So slower water equals greater deposition. And one of the most productive estuaries on the Oregon coast is Netarts Bay. And this is a photo of it from the air right here. So this is the town of Netarts, and then you're going around the corner, you're starting to get to Oceanside over here. Netarts is so productive because there's a lot of freshwater streams that come into it, but none of them are huge raging rivers. They're all pretty tiny little streams. So they're low velocity. And when you're low velocity, there's not a ton of energy in it. So they tend to come in and they have lots of pine needles and silt and stuff. But then when they hit this big body of water that, you know, dwarfs them compared to the stream size, they dump all those nutrients right away. They slow way down and they stop. So low energy, big deposition. And that deposition then promotes the growth of algae and eelgrass and other things like that, because it's not an area that the water is moving back and forth and ripping them up. It's a pretty low energy environment in here. So the tide comes in, streams meet that tide force, they stop, drop, and grow. I just made that up. Pretty good. Okay. In an estuary, 10% of the sand that you dig in down in there, the muck, can be organic, which is a pretty high percentage. So, you know, you've got some just basic like mud and silt and sediment. We'll talk about grain size in a second. But that is just ground down rock. But this is 10% or more can be organic. And burrowing animals feed on that organic matter. So again, if it's low energy coming in other words, there's not a lot of velocity, when the stream hits that big body of water, plus if you got a tide going the opposite direction, it'll basically slow it to a stop, and then all of those nutrients will fall to the bottom, and that becomes food for everything that's down in there. And as those layers build up, there's nutrients that get buried deeper, and then organisms like your sand shrimp and other things will burrow in and feed on those. Okay. Netarts in Sand Lake are some of the most productive on all of the West Coast. That includes California, Oregon, and Washington. They're rated as some of the cleanest and some of the most productive estuaries out there, which is pretty cool. And here's a picture of that mixing effect as the fresh water is coming in, salt water making that wedge underneath, and then those two pushing against each other. That causes turbulence, and that causes all of this just to get mixed up really nicely in there. And just a fun fact, if you were to dig down into an estuary, you've got all this organic matter that's buried down in there, layer upon layer upon layer, right? There's lots of dead leaves and pine needles and all kinds of nutrients down in there. So animals burrow down to get at that stuff. The bay ghost shrimp is one of the biggest ones that loves to burrow in our bays and creates these elaborate tunnels, which allows oxygen and water to move through it. You also get a lot of these sandworms or bloodworms that will move through and dig. Clams will bury themselves down in there, and they will feed off the surface because they're a tube nose and things like, or not tube nose, but a filter feeder with their tube spigots. And Netarts Bay produces some 5 pounds per square yard of phytoplankton. So as well as being productive down in the bottom, there's also a ton of photosynthesis going on in Netarts Bay. Most estuary ecosystems produce 0.1 pound per square yard, and Netarts Bay produces 5 pounds per square yard. So that's a pretty large number. It's a orders of magnitude more production than any other. And you can really see this when you go out in Netarts Bay. For one, we have some of the best clam digging in the entire Oregon coast. Clam density is insane out there. And when you look at some of the bird populations that are out there, you look at the seal population that lives out there. There's a group of about 80 seals that are out there just hanging out. You look at, again, the bird density. You can go up and down and just see in one corner of Netarts Bay at any given moment, there's about 15 great blue herons that are feeding in this one area. And to feed 15 birds of that size in a very small area like that has to be productive. So we live in a pretty rad ecosystem where we've got great examples of all of these things. We have kelp forests off Cape Lookout. You can go tide pooling off of Oceanside. And then we've got Netarts Bay and Sand Lake for really productive estuary ecosystems as well. So good examples of all of those right in your own backyard. Get out and see them. do your weekly questions, and yeah, I'm done. And, stay bougie. Sapora out.